Tekken. It's a big franchise spanning 20 years, 9 main games, and a multitude of spin-offs, comics, movies, and anime. What we want to do is tell you all about it, which will take some time. This is part 1, which covers the original trilogy. We hope you'll enjoy it, so with that out of the way, we humbly present to you Togashi Naishi's Tekken Retrospective.
Tekken started in the arcade scene and was born out of a heated rivalry Namco had with Sega. This rivalry had started in the late 70s, and they were always trying to one-up each other. Parts of this rivalry included Namco releasing Rally X in 1980 and Sega answering back with Sega Turbo in 1981, and this rally just kept going. If Namco released a great game or put in new features, Sega would follow up soon after with an even better game, and vice versa. In the early 80s and 90s, the arcade scene was huge for competing companies, which was in turn great for gamers. Back then, the arcade scene was the place to be if you wanted to be on the bleeding edge of technology. Arcade games had gameplay, sound, and graphics that couldn't be replicated on home consoles, so games that were ported to your home console would usually be a big downgrade and a letdown. This meant that there was a huge market for companies to take advantage of, as players were always hungry for the next big thing. So, for the uninitiated, let's explain how an arcade actually functions and how companies like Sega and Namco make money off of this. Each arcade game had its own dedicated arcade cabinet, so the arcade operator would need to buy entire arcade cabinets from companies who made them, like Sega and Namco. They were expensive, so it was a risky investment, which meant that having the more popular arcade games were crucial in order to stay in business. Arcade machines were designed around putting in a quarter or 100 yen in Japan. Then the game would start and the arcade would profit. Playing the game usually only lasted for a couple of minutes, because if they lasted for hours, there was no way the arcade could turn a profit. This meant that certain types of games, like role-playing games, wouldn't work, as they simply took too long. The games needed to be instantly satisfying, making you want to keep playing. Having short, explosively satisfying games were definitely a great idea to keep customers interested, but there was one element they stuck to that made the arcade happy, and that was the difficulty. The trade-off was that the games were extremely difficult, which meant you would need to keep putting quarters in to get closer to completing it. Frustrating difficulty made many players feel cheated, and the developers had a hard time figuring out how to make both the arcade operators and players happy. If the developers created bigger arcade machines, the players would be happy because they would have a great time, but the cost for switching these big machines in and out would be too expensive for the arcade operators. That is when developers started making games where more than one player could play at once, because operators would get twice the money and players could work together. Capcom did something like this with Final Fight, which released in December 1989. It proved to be a step in the right direction, with players helping each other get to the end of the game, but developers were still dictating the difficulty to a sometimes unfair degree, so there was definitely room for improvement. At this point, Capcom made a game where two players would compete head-on, and this would change the arcade scene forever. Street Fighter II released in arcades in 1991, and it was the first game to establish and define how a fighting game should work as a genre. There was definitely fighting games around before, but Street Fighter II set the rules that are now so obvious, like having 2 life bars on each side that you needed to whittle down in order to win the match. Street Fighter also had a very clear flow that a fighting game could use. You would introduce your characters, you would load a stage, you fought to the bitter end, then you'd load the next stage and repeat the process. This formula was rarely seen in games before, and Street Fighter established it. If you think about it like that, after Street Fighter 2 released, people were no longer playing fighting games. They were either playing Street Fighter, or they were playing Street Fighter clones. Regardless of whether you were playing a clone or the real thing, universal appeal of fighting games was being able to play against another person, instead of a computer opponent with a set of patterns.
普遍の心理だと思うんですよね。それはなんでかというと、人間はやっぱり柔らかいから。頭も、それからなんていうんですか、その感性もその時の体の調子で変わったりするじゃないですか。同じ人がやっても、そういうさまざまな変化が人間ほど多様なものはないんですよね。それがプレイに反映されるんで、ゲームの主流っていうか、その考え方を変えたきっかけにストリートファイターがなったと思いますね。
Street Fighter 2 fixed the problem prevalent in arcades up to that point, which was balancing the enjoyment for players and the profits for arcade operators. You could now dictate both the difficulty and your spendings, because the better you got, the less money you spent, so the losers would have to pay for the privilege of playing you again. Playing a round of Street Fighter was also a very fast process, so money was continuously pumped into the machine, which gave huge profits to the arcade operators and in turn to Capcom. Street Fighter was a perfect solution to a growing problem, and Capcom had essentially caught lightning in a bottle. The entire world realized that there was money to be made, so every company wanted to create their own version of Street Fighter to rake in on the success. One of these companies was Sega, and they named their Street Fighter clone Virtua Fighter. Virtua Fighter was the first fighting game to feature 3D polygonal graphics, and it was a huge shift from the 2D games flooding the arcades. While Street Fighter and other games had supernatural elements to them, with fireballs darting across the screen and stretching limbs, Virtua Fighter was grounded in reality, and every fighter used real martial arts. The combination of, at the time, groundbreaking graphics and a focus on realism caught the attention of players everywhere. Not to be outdone, Namco set out to create their own fighting game. What Namco initially wanted to do was create a testing platform where they would see what could be accomplished with 3D. But instead, Virtua Fighter ran at only half that speed. The reason why they wanted to make it 60 FPS was because adding more frames per second means that players would have more time to react in a game, and 30 additional frames also lets them create more fluid animations. Oh, and the added benefit of telling Sega that Namco's fighting game was more technologically advanced. The game's director and lead designer Seiji Ishii had previously worked as a motion designer on Virtua Fighter, and on Rave War he wanted to dedicate his entire attention to the 3D, the models, and the frame rate. They wanted to push the technological boundaries of what was possible at the time, and they had basically created a vehicle to try out animation. They wanted to prove that they could create a 3D character that would respond to your inputs, and that was essentially the primary goal behind the project. During development, they kept adding more stuff, new characters, a story that was a bit all over the place, and finally they changed the title from Rave War to Tekken. When companies were creating their Street Fighter clones, they wanted to strike a balance between where they wanted to be original and where they would copy the formula that worked, which usually came down to being original in character designs and story while following Street Fighter's gameplay. However, there was a few developers that decided to put their own twist on it. Virtua Fighter used a 3-button layout with a punch, kick, and block button. Mortal Kombat used a 5-button layout with a high and low punch and kick button, and a button for blocking. The block button they put in there just to stand out from Street Fighter. And finally we have Tekken, which designed a 4-button layout with the intention to make it more intuitive. Tekken opted not to use a block button and simply used Street Fighter's joystick design by holding back to block and using directional inputs to create special attacks. Instead of having buttons that corresponded with the strength of an attack, each of the 4 buttons was assigned to a limb of the character, which did make it fairly intuitive. Players could watch what was happening on screen and figure out the appropriate command, even if it was their first time playing. If someone kicked low with their right leg, it would most likely be performed by pushing down and right kick. Because of this, there needed to be an abundance of available moves players could discover, and throughout the series' history, the move list for each character would slowly grow into the triple digits. So, it was intuitive to play around and deal damage, but there were several different ways you could go about doing it. You could deal damage with striking attacks and with throws. While there are varying rules attached to them, there's a general rule of thumb you can follow. You can block striking attacks, but you can't block throws. Throws were a way to keep you on your toes, but you could still trick your opponent up by relying on 3 types of striking attacks. You could attack with high attacks, low attacks, and mid attacks. As you'd expect, high attacks hit from the chest up, and they will generally miss completely if you're crouching. Low attacks hit the legs and need to be blocked while crouching. Fairly basic stuff, but mid attack is the trickster of the group, because mid is essentially a high attack that turns into a low attack. Without the mid attack, which is also known as an overhead, there would be nothing to prevent players from crouch blocking the entire match, since crouching both avoids high attacks and blocks low attacks. The point of the mid attack is to mix players up, so they can't rely on one solution the entire match. Since the developers wanted to see what could be achieved in 3D, they naturally wanted the animation to look as realistic as possible, so they created a graphics engine that was custom built to display fighting games. They now had an engine that could display fluid martial arts, but the team needed to understand realistic 3D movement, which came at a cost. Namco had dabbled with 2D fighting games before, namely Knuckleheads, but the difference between Knuckleheads and Tekken was that extra dimension. 2D fighting games are designed almost like a flipbook, with several pictures in a row completing an animation. This is known as the illusion of movement, and it gives you freedom to ignore the intricacies of body language. But with Tekken's focus on realism, they couldn't ignore those details. They kept questioning how the body kept balanced after throwing a punch or kick, and how certain attacks affected characters in 3D space. They ended up giving every human character a martial art that exists in the real world, and characters would not only use attacks from the martial art, but even rituals, etiquette, and traditions. While this is interesting, it should all be taken with a grain of salt. Yes, it is true that every character uses an existing martial art and that character designs are culturally representative of where they're from, but it's mostly for convenience sake. When they are creating characters, they find a few traits they want the character to have, like serious, shy, or arrogant. Then they go with the martial art style that would best suit the character, because it gives them a sort of cheat sheet to work off of. Then, just by having any given martial art style, they can grab aspects such as nationality, look, clothing, and then go further from there. Some styles will work better than others, because while people can appreciate seeing a real martial art and parts of its storied history, Tekken still needs to look and feel interesting, because at the end of the day, it's a video game. The character animations and techniques need to fit the game, so they will bend the rules more often than not. In real martial arts, throws usually aren't this spectacular, so embellishment is key when making something suitable for a video game. In short, if you see something in Tekken that looks genuine, it most likely is, but don't forget that it's a game first and foremost. The development team wanted to try their hands at telling a story in a fighting game, which was rarely done at the time. They created the frameworks of a story they could keep expanding upon with each new installment. The story of Tekken is essentially split into 2 parts, an A story and a B story. The A story is considered the main story, focusing on telling a larger-than-life story with a small cast. The B stories are much smaller in scope and serve as a means to flesh out the characters and the world of Tekken. However, they aren't separate entities. They often intersect, and certain B stories have small plot elements that are relevant to the A story. Tekken leaves it up to the player to put these bits and pieces together into a coherent narrative. They ended up mixing elements of fantasy and created an alternate Earth so technologically advanced and bizarre that they could essentially do anything. Even in the first game, they delve into supernatural territory, and by the second game, they had already included a boxing dinosaur and kangaroo. They could do weird off-the-wall comedy, pay homage to anything in popular culture.
Analysis complete. Both fighters have been positively identified. Both fighters' battle power levels are over 9,000.
And even collaborate with talents from other walks of life without it posing any real issues. This created a unique blend not present in other games. Anything could happen, and that was part of the fun. Tekken rolled out in arcades during December of 1994, and they had, for the most part, met their goals. Tekken ran at 60 FPS, they had put textures on the character models which were convincingly animated. It felt like proper martial arts, which they exaggerated just enough to feel believable, but fun at the same time. All in all, it was a good start for the new franchise, and they enjoyed some success in the arcades, but Sega had beat them to the punch by releasing Virtua Fighter 2 a month before Tekken released. Those goals Tekken had met would have put them on the map as the first 3D fighter with those graphical selling points, but Sega wasn't having any of it. Virtua Fighter 2 hit the scene and it ran at 60 FPS, featured textures on the character models, and had fully modeled 3D scenery. Tekken's scenery was, by comparison, unimpressive. It was a flat backdrop that wrapped around the players and went on infinitely. Virtua Fighter 2 was a gigantic improvement on the original game, and it was the sequel to an already established franchise, so Tekken was competing with a big threat. Tekken was built on the Namco System 11 arcade board, which was inferior to Sega's Model 2 arcade board, which Virtua Fighter 2 was based on. This was both fortunate and unfortunate. Tekken didn't look as graphically impressive as Virtua Fighter 2, but it made for a cheaper arcade cabinet, which made it more attractive for smaller arcades, and that is how Namco marketed it. Fortunately for Namco, Tekken's intuitive gameplay helped give it mass appeal. Unlike the highly technical Virtua Fighter, which was very popular with the more hardcore crowd, Tekken embraced players of all skill levels. While there was skill involved, players could generally pick it up and start having fun. And the most important thing to take from the first game is a simple concept that has been with the franchise ever since. The instant you start hitting buttons, you should be having fun. This is something the first Tekken game did perfectly. There's a certain sense of weight behind anything the characters do and react to. The way they combined collision detection, sound design, and reactive animation made every attack you connected with seem gut-wrenchingly painful.
The consensus from the public was that Tekken was an okay start for a franchise, but it wasn't a mega smash hit, and arcades didn't treat Tekken all that well. Because of their competitive aspects, it was customary for fighting game cabinets to be placed back to back in arcades, but Tekken cabinets wasn't considered much more than technical showcases, so they were mostly tucked away in a corner somewhere. Namco felt that polygonal animation was the future, so they took elements they knew worked and let the public try it out while they were busy testing it out. Turns out they didn't miss the mark by that much, because they were only missing a few key ingredients, and one of them was the Sony PlayStation. Tekken was on the Namco System 11 arcade board, which Namco was co-developing with Sony, so the hardware was based on the PlayStation. The major difference was that the System 11 used ROM chips to store data, while the PlayStation used CDs. While CDs could store more data, they needed to be continuously loaded. Long load times was a problem in the early days of CD games, but Namco had older employees that had worked with limited data storage, so they were experts in data compression. They tinkered endlessly, not only with the size of the data, but where it was placed on the disc. They realized that data on the outer portion of a CD read faster than data towards the center. Tekken was one of the most complicated PlayStation 1 games at the time, but thanks to employees like Masanori Yamada, Tekken had the fastest load times around. Because of their compatibility, arcade games that were on the System 11 could be easily ported to the PlayStation, and Tekken debuted on the Sony PlayStation in 1995. The PlayStation version was a faithful port of the arcade version, and in many ways it was superior. Instead of going straight to the credits after beating the final boss, you were now treated to short video endings that told you more about the character you played.
beating the game also unlocked the rival characters, which played identical to the other fighters, and they even had the same voice samples. While a small addition, Namco accepted the rival characters as a part of the universe and slowly gave them their own identities and roles in the world of Tekken with later installments. The ending videos had some odd choices here and there. A group of children were digitized into King's ending video, and no one else has live action elements in their endings. It's also repeated in Tekken 2, and while it's not present in Tekken 3, they did put King with some real children in a rare promotional piece Namco did for Tekken 3. I don't know why they did this, but there are a few possibilities I can think of. Due to King's backstory, they needed several unique child models, which would have eaten up a lot of resources, so they opted to make it live action to keep on schedule. King is partly based on Mexican wrestler Fray Tormenta, a Catholic priest who became a masked wrestler in order to support an orphanage. So maybe they felt that the only way they could get the emotional weight of that story was by using real children in its ending. I originally thought it was because it's the only crowd shot in the entire game, but this is not true. Yoshimitsu's ending shows him riding on horse through a village filled with children, men, women, and the elderly, so this confuses things even more. At the end of the day, it's not really important, but it's a strange decision nonetheless, and I would love to know why they did it. Since they already created ending videos, they also created some new opening cinematics. You could listen to the entire soundtrack with a CD player, and they even added Namco's arcade game Galaga before the game started, which contained a hidden secret if you managed to complete it. But just like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, the secrets didn't stop there. The secrets in Tekken ranged from hidden moves to hidden characters and even plot elements. There was no in-game move list for characters, and it was hard to find a narrative thread when there wasn't a single line of dialogue. Instead, you would need to read the game's manual. This included a short synopsis for the tournament, some character information, and a short move list for each character. The manual wasn't all that useful, and it didn't come close to listing everything a character could do, so it was up to each individual player to find all the secrets that Tekken had to offer. Perfect! Most of them are useless when fighting, but it's a nice incentive to reward dedicated players. For what is basically the simplest Tekken port Namco ever did, they put in a lot of work that they didn't necessarily have to do, but it's this hard work and attention to detail that made Tekken worth the price of admission. Let's explore the story in depth, starting with the title.
Tekken.
This translates from Japanese kanji to Iron Fist, which is an abbreviated version of the tournament in the game, which is known as the King of Iron Fist Tournament. The tournament itself is sponsored by the Mishima Saibatsu, and whoever wins the tournament receives a large cash prize and control over the Saibatsu. After the tournament has been announced, there is usually a roll call for all the fighters who join the tournament, all with their own reasons to enter. Out of all the characters in the game, there's only one of them whose ending and story will advance the plot of the next game, but you wouldn't find out which of them that was until the next game rolled around. Let's see what happened in the first game and look at how the Mishima Saibatsu turned into a global superpower. The story begins with Heihachi Mishima announcing the King of Iron Fist tournament. 8 fighters remained after winning death matches all over the world, all striving to dethrone Heihachi to be crowned the King of Iron Fist. Everyone had their own reasons to enter the tournament, but only Kazuya Mishima entered for a chance at revenge. In the first Tekken game, the story focuses almost solely on the father-son relationship between Kazuya and Heihachi. The Mishimas typically get very large story arcs dedicated to them compared to the other characters. So in the first game, it's all about Kazuya and Heihachi, and Kazuya's ending is the canonical one for the first Tekken. What we are about to say is not entirely present in the first game, but is slowly revealed through the entire franchise. We will be taking some liberties with how the story is originally told, just so it's easier to understand, because some of this isn't explained until Tekken 5. We will talk about some inconsistencies as well, and there are elements we will hold off on explaining until they are more relevant to the story. With that in mind, we will be jumping back in time to the earliest known point of the Mishima Saibatsu. The Mishima Saibatsu was founded by Jinpachi Mishima, who is the earliest Mishima member we know of. Unlike the rest of the Mishima family, Jinpachi is a kind, honorable, and wise man. He was famous throughout the world for his strength as a martial artist, and throughout his travels he ended up making many acquaintances. One of them was Wang Jinrei, who became Jinpachi's best friend, and Jinpachi let Wang live on the vast Mishima estate. Together with an unknown woman, he had a son who he named Heihachi. Heihachi grew up as Jinpachi's heir and eventually met and married Kasumi, and they had a son who they named Kazuya Mishima. Next to nothing is known about Kazumi, because she has never made a canonical appearance, appearing only briefly in Tekken the motion picture. Kazumi is the trickiest part of the entire Mishima puzzle to solve, because close to nothing is known about her, but she's still essential to the story, being the wife of Heihachi and mother to Kazuya. After 20 long years, we finally meet Kazumi in her first canonical appearance. She appears in the Tekken 7 teaser trailer, promptly titled Kazumi's Legacy, which came in two versions, the regular trailer and an extended version. The regular trailer shows Kazumi in a temple, talking to an unknown person about needing to stop someone. What we can gather from this is that Kazumi is probably alive, but the extended trailer turns this on its head. Before we see Kazumi this time, it's headlined with the sentence several decades ago, meaning what we see of Kazumi is not in the present. This also explains why we see her through this grainy old film filter. She also talks about Kazuya while we see him as a child training with Jinpachi. It is too soon to go into details about her, so for now, all we will say is that her name is Kazumi, that Heihachi loved his wife, and she was around long enough to partly raise Kazuya. Kazuya turned out to be a kind, frail, and timid boy, and Heihachi hated this about his son. Kazuya was doted on by Jinpachi, and they had a loving relationship, which might have been reinforced due to how much Heihachi abused and tormented Kazuya over the years. Jinpachi, along with Wang, watched Kazuya and Heihachi growing up, with conflicting emotions. Like his father, Heihachi had an iron will and an old-fashioned sense of honor in battle, but he was consumed by always wanting more power, which eventually culminated in him betraying Jinpachi and seizing control over the Saibatsu. Heihachi, being the guy he is, steered the Saibatsu towards the military industry. In this period, the Mishima Saibatsu grew both rich and powerful. Heihachi imprisoned his father in a sacred shrine known as Honmaru, and that was the last anyone ever heard of Jinpachi. Before Jinpachi's disappearance, he had confided in Wang that the Mishima clan must be destroyed in order to bring about peace to the world. After his disappearance, Wang mourns the loss of his best friend, while being conflicted about what he should do with the Mishimas in order to honor Jinpachi's ideals. Life went on as usual after Jinpachi's disappearance, and when Kazuya was 5 years old, Heihachi had grown tired of his weak son, so he threw him off a cliff. Heihachi's reasoning was that if Kazuya was truly a Mishima and his true successor, he would survive the fall and climb back up. Kazuya survived, but he had to make a deal with the devil to do so, and it left him with a deep scar on his chest, as well as infusing the devil gene into his body. As a result, Kazuya became cold-blooded and brutal, seeking only to hone his karate skills. To motivate Kazuya, Heihachi adopted an orphan named Li Chaolan, so Kazuya would have a rival growing up, which would make him aspire to grow even stronger. Even though Heihachi took Li into his family and was impressed with his street fighting skill, he has no feelings for him whatsoever, and only uses him to irritate Kazuya. For 16 years, Kazuya would go on a tournament winning spree with the help of the Devil Gene, and the only one to fight him to a draw was the American judo fighter Paul Phoenix. Eventually, Heihachi decided to test his son's strength, so he announced the first King of Iron Fist tournament, and at the age of 26, Kazuya, fueled by the hatred for his father, enters. Kazuya was able to defeat opponent after opponent, and eventually came face to face with his father. The stage of battle was the same cliff he himself was thrown off of all those years ago. Kazuya finally came out victorious. And then he threw his unconscious father down the cliff, making the story come full circle. In the first Tekken, Kazuya was unquestionably the protagonist. Being a child abused by his corrupt corporate tyrant of a father, his anger and frustration was understandable, although it wasn't a particularly fresh idea. Most people just thought of Kazuya as another cliché hero, and he shared a lot of design similarities to Street Fighter's Ryu. Both characters wear simple white geese with a red accessory. That's become a bit of a trademark for both characters. Paul Phoenix, who is clearly Kazuya's rival in the first game, is a hot-blooded blonde American with a red gi, making Paul an homage to Ken, Ryu's rival and friend in Street Fighter. However, there was a big difference between Ryu and Kazuya. Kazuya actually had an evil side, whereas Ryu was the pure fighter who simply wanted to grow stronger. Ironically, Ryu would later get an alter ego named Evil Ryu in 1998, but I have a hard time seeing Kazuya being an inspiration for it. In Japanese storytelling, especially anime and manga, it's a very typical storyline to have your pure hero become corrupted and then suffer a fall from grace, where he needs to ultimately rid himself of his corruption, either accomplished by himself or by the help of his friends. Either that, or it can become an issue of a split timeline. Your hero continually fights it in one timeline while he has succumbed to it in the other. While Kazuya reached out to the devil in a moment of weakness, Tekken features no split timelines and instead shows how Kazuya continuously deals with his evil side. Unfortunately, the only way players could find out about Kazuya's true nature in the first game was the secret PlayStation 1 palette swap, which turned out to be Devil. You could unlock it by performing a certain feat in Galaga. Galaga was included as a minigame while Tekken loaded, and if players could do a perfect shootdown on all 8 levels with only a single continue, they would unlock Devil as a palette swap of Kazuya. It didn't change how Kazuya played though, it was only a costume change. Outside of this, players wouldn't see Kazuya's true nature until Tekken 2 was released. This is a side note, but Kazuya's original Devil design is strikingly similar to Star Platinum from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Seeing as Stardust Crusaders ended its run in 1992 and the entirety of Japan was suffering from JoJo fever at the time, it's not unlikely that they took inspiration from JoJo. After all, Masamichi Abe was a huge fan of the series, and even based Paul Phoenix's appearance on Jean-Pierre Polnareff. The Tekken project team has gone on record saying that they would intentionally mislead fans sometimes, and that the story actually has a parallel continuity. This basically means that whatever happens in the non-canon endings can be relevant to the main story. One of these elements, for example, is Kazuya's ending in Tekken 5. In it, Kazuya meets Jinpachi again, and it shows a short flashback where he playfully trained with Jinpachi as a child. This was a joke ending, but since the extended version of the Tekken 7 trailer came out, which shows the exact same scene, this can be confirmed as canon material. The Tekken team saying that they intentionally mislead fans could be a convenient method for them to evade obvious plot holes, just so certain story elements fit into the grand scheme of things. Even though I say that, there are plot elements that have been cleverly avoided to create an air of mystery, like Kazumi Mishima. There have been attempts to fill in the blanks of the Mishima family in the forms of novels, movies, anime, manga, and comics, but Namco isn't making it very easy for fans. For example, there is a novel that delves into the early history of the Mishima family, but like every single piece of Tekken fiction, it's non-canon. It's great that Namco allows their brand to be explored, but when everything's labeled non-canon, it makes it a pointless venture. Tekken has a lot of characters, and while there are many interesting plot elements to cover, it would simply take too long. For the sake of keeping a logical narrative thread, some characters will be the focal point more than other characters. So we apologize beforehand that we won't go through all the characters, and in some cases your favorite in their entirety. As stated earlier, the game was pretty broken, and there's a few reasons for that. Since the development team were working on the bleeding edge of technology, they simply had no idea what they were doing. They had no clue how to balance or adjust characters to make them interesting from a gameplay perspective, and they had huge technical issues when working on the game. For example, Jack was one of the biggest issues for the team, because they technically couldn't do the scaling for his lower body, which is why Jack ended up looking the way he does. One of the developers, Katsuhiro Harada, considers this entire period disastrous, and he says that all the characters were difficult and none of them were fun. Let's talk shortly about the wake-up game, which is arguably the biggest roadblock for Tekken newcomers. If you get knocked down in fighting games, this is usually an automatic process before you get back to the action. Tekken allows players to keep attacking downed opponents, and you need to pick the right option to either keep your opponent grounded or to get back up. On the ground you have 7 options, each for different situations, and your opponent needs to read your game plan correctly to keep you there. If you're unlucky, it's completely possible to die without ever getting back up, and strategies are built around keeping you there. This is known as the wake-up game, but it also has a different name, Okiseme. Let me give you a simple example of Okiseme. Heihachi lands his regular grab, which leaves his opponent on the ground. If the opponent stays grounded, Heihachi can get a stomp. If the opponent tries to move, like rolling or rising back up, Heihachi can use his hammer punch to keep them grounded for a repeat scenario. This is a 50-50 mix-up scenario, meaning that either the opponent gets up or he stays down. It's actually rather simple. A player will choose one of 2 options, but the difference between the two is like night and day, which makes choosing between the two strangely difficult. This dilemma of how do I get back up again became a big part of Tekken's overall gameplay, and it's something that divided players. Some reveled in the you're never safe aspect, while others walked away. Tekken has these options to this day, but most of it is useless and not very applicable in competitive play. This is also true for mostly anything in Tekken, as the move lists are considered bloated. But Tekken's treasure trove of secrets definitely appealed to casual players, so it was a huge success in that regard. The move list consists of what Tekken calls attack strings, which is basically a series of consecutive strikes. A single string could consist of low, high, and mid attacks, but each work differently. If you manage to hit the character off the ground before they hit the ground, they would be in an airborne state. In this airborne state, you could actually keep them in the air by continuously hitting them, so you basically juggled your opponent. You're completely vulnerable before you hit the ground, so taking advantage of this and juggling your opponent for extra damage is known as a juggle combo, which has become a staple of the franchise. It was actually possible that a single hit could mean losing all your life.
If you did this, you had pulled off a death combo.
Since getting hit once was basically a death sentence and attack strings were hard to both block and punish, players resorted to the only option they had left. They just wouldn't get hit at all. The way they accomplished this was moving rapidly within the infinite playing space they had available, so they could dart in and out of the opponent's attempts to attack them. If they did it properly, they made the attack miss completely, and since hitting air in real life gives off a whiffing sound, that's what they named it. Whiffing allowed players to avoid getting hit by unfair moves, and it gave them control over matches that were otherwise unwinnable.
KO.
This created a unique kind of fighting experience with Tekken. Because of the flowing attack strings, Tekken was more about deception and rhythm to let you control the pace of a match, instead of slowly picking apart an opponent's defense, which set it apart from other fighting games at the time. All these different elements make up the framework of the first Tekken, but this can be applied to any fighting game. It's not unique to Tekken in any way. What Tekken did to separate itself was by having more variations than other fighters at the time. Discussing or at least mentioning these elements are important because they are partly the reason why so many people love Tekken, and consequently, fighting games. In a time where everyone wanted to copy Street Fighter to make a quick buck, Tekken took a few notes but came off as fairly original. Tekken copied Virtua Fighter's 3D character motions and Street Fighter's block system plus a bizarre roster that wasn't exclusively human. The characters didn't come off as copied, although the Mishimas probably took a few notes from Ryu. After they finished work on the first Tekken, they immediately rolled up their sleeves and went to work on the sequel. It was time to show the world that Tekken wasn't just a one-hit wonder. With Tekken behind them, they could now take a deep look at what worked and what didn't. Players enjoyed what they had to play with in Tekken, but it lacked some polish. Character models weren't all they could have been, moves weren't really balanced properly, the stages felt more like hollow backdrops than actual locations, and have to cast played identical to their counterparts, so there was definitely a lot to work on. When they looked at the sales, it was clear that the PlayStation and Tekken were a perfect combination, so the decision was made that the series should remain on the console. After the first game, they had started to understand the genre a bit better, and they had gotten used to the hardware, and now they had a clear-cut goal. The goal was to gain status as a fighting game, as well as aiming for a benchmark title to prove development and technological power, putting in as much new technology as possible. Tekken 2 released in August 1995 in the arcades, and on the PlayStation in the following year.
There's not much to say about the arcade version, as the PlayStation version is considered vastly superior, and considering that it stayed the #1 arcade game in America for 24 straight weeks, that is saying something. The only notable difference is that the arcade version played at 60 FPS, while the PlayStation version remained at 30. Namco wanted players to get their money's worth, and their philosophy seems to have been a quality product for a reasonable price. So they just made sure to cram in as many extras and secrets as possible, which was an issue to begin with, as a CD didn't have nearly as much memory as the arcade board they work with. A lot of these extras have become staples of the franchise, while others can be considered timestamps of what was popular at the time, like Big Head Mode.
Fight!
On the PlayStation, you were treated to brand new opening cinematics and endings and remixed music. There was Survival Mode, where you fight endless battles until you lose all your health.
Time Attack, a shortened arcade mode where you aim to complete it in the shortest possible time. Team Battle, which allows players to create teams of up to 8 fighters and battle it out, and Practice Mode. The first 3 can be considered fun extras, as they don't really add to the game that much, but Practice Mode was a very welcome addition, and it, along with Survival Mode, has been in every game after this point. Practice Mode allowed players to test out characters in a neutral, safe environment with several technical additions. You could see the total damage of attacks, and what your controller input data look like. If you wanted, you could make every attack a counter hit, and you could create small replays. It gave you a better technical understanding of what you were doing in the game. Thanks to innovations like Practice Mode, beating up your friends was no longer the only way you could enjoy the game. Tekken 2 has mostly just refined what they originally had, with some minor balancing here and there. But it's still the same old broken Tekken. Death combos were everywhere, even making their way into the multi-hitting chain throws, but let's step back for a little bit and look at what's fundamentally changed. Tekken's been given an overhaul, so the character models have been improved. They have been smoothed out and more closely resemble actual human anatomy. The biggest change overall is probably Kuma, who now looks closer to an actual bear instead of just being kind of a mess. There is subtle muscle definition added in with smart use of gradients, and they fixed some of their previous models, like King's weird cat paw hands, and they fixed Kunimitsu's gender issue. She now looks and speaks like a woman. It is still played on a 2D plane, but you can now roll into the background by holding left punch, which adds to the wake-up game. With the addition of the move list, you can finally see how every character's moves were performed, but you only got a small taste of their entire moveset. The move list shows you roughly half of their entire moveset, omitting stuff like the chain throws. It's noteworthy that King's Octopus Hold is the only move to be exclusive to Tekken 2, but it really was way too powerful.
Perfect!
It naturally combined a fast low attack into a ton of damage, so removing it was understandable.
King wins!
Outside of secret moves, they added attack reversals that certain characters could use to punish overly aggressive players, and it was now possible to throw your opponent from the back. These were fairly logical extensions, as it was often possible to be in a position to throw your opponent facing backwards, and there are many martial arts based on attacking through receiving, like Judo, which is Paul's martial art. Namco would later retcon Paul Phoenix's Judo background into a man who uses integrated martial arts, with Judo as a basis, but in Tekken 2 he is technically still a judoka, so he's one of the few characters who got the ability to use attack reversals. Just like a mid, an attack reversal isn't a be-all end-all tool. It can only catch high or mid attacks, and it requires precise timing. If you just stand there hammering an attack reversal, you are vulnerable to throws, and the enemy can start using lows, which you can't reversal. Attack reversals are also a good example on how detailed Tekken 2 actually is. Each character that can use it has around 4 to 6 unique reversal animations, fitting different situations. There are a few repeat offenders that travel between characters, but they added just enough variation that you want to keep abusing the move, because the animations are both inventive and hilariously over the top.
Hey-o!
Reactive animation and overall body language has been improved, so whoever's on the receiving end looks genuinely terrified. This is another good example of Tekken threading that very fine line of being realistic, but exaggerated enough for it to be fun instead of being very disturbing.
Hey-o! You win!
Since the animations had improved, this also naturally translated into an added layer of depth to the throws. If you were caught in a throw before, you were left with no other option than taking damage, but if you were fast enough, you could now input button combinations to get out of the throw, which is known as teching. The ability to tech throws might have been added solely because of Nina's, King's, and Bruce's chain throws, many of which will take all your life away if you got caught in one of the grabs. Having two characters interact like this is the biggest change going into the second game, and the developers seem to be getting more comfortable with the animation.
Let's take a closer look at the story this time around. 2 years have passed since the first tournament, and Kazuya Mishima has been busy at work helming the Mishima Saibatsu. He somehow made it even more corrupt than he used to be, making enemies all around the globe, which meant constant threats against his life. Because of this, he recruits Anna Williams, Gunryu, and newcomer Bruce Irvin as bodyguards, and retreats into what can only be some sort of Mishima Saibatsu Doom Fortress. At this point, he becomes a recluse, controlling the Mishima Saibatsu from the shadows, while taking counsel from a shadowy figure. He hears that Heihachi is still alive, who is coming back for revenge and to get his company back. To draw him out, Kazuya announces the second King of Iron Fist tournament with $1 trillion prize purse for the winner. This is 1,000 times more than a prize purse in the first tournament, meaning that either Kazuya is completely depleting all the funds the Mishima Saibatsu have, or he is such a genius entrepreneur that he managed to increase the net worth of the Mishima Saibatsu 1,000 times over in 2 years. Seeing as essentially every character that gets a chance to start a business ends up bankrupt within a year or two, Kazuya is probably the only guy with business smarts in the entire Tekken universe. At the very least, he's evil enough to make it work. With the tournament announced, several returning characters join the tournament again to complete their objectives, along with a few newcomers. Most of the cast's stories are generally repeated, like Nina being ordered to assassinate the head of the Mishima Saibatsu, but there are a few exceptions. King is the only character to suffer a complete breakdown as a child in his care died. Armor King frantically looked for his friend until he found him drunk in an alleyway. He helps him through his ordeal and trains him back to his former glory. Hong Kong cop Lei Wulong is investigating killings in his district, which all leads back to Kazuya Mishima. He joins to arrest Bruce Irvin, who killed his partner, and getting to the bottom of Kazuya's illegal dealings. Bruce Irvin is a Muay Thai heavyweight kickboxing champion, and he is ordered by Kazuya to fight as his combat champion. Taekwondo master Baek Do-san accidentally killed his own father during a sparring session, which made him doubt his own skills. Being a completely rational human being, he went on a rampage, destroyed several dojos, one of which was owned by martial law, and injured most of their students. To add insult to injury, he left Law a note telling him to meet him at the tournament. The characters that are left can be sorted in two simple categories: the ones who join for revenge, and the ones who join to rescue someone. These characters pretty much maintain their status quo both from an emotional perspective and a story perspective. Rounding off the roster before going into the main story are Roger and Alex and Devil and Angel, who are each other's palette swaps, which was the beginning of a Tekken staple. The main story this time around centers on a bigger roster, but it's still a Mishima story. The role of antagonist and protagonist has been reversed, with Heihachi Mishima taking center stage. After Kazuya defeated him, he threw him down the same cliff he was thrown down. Just like his son, Heihachi survived and he climbed back up. Heihachi retreated into a mountain dojo along with his pet and bodyguard Kuma, and together they trained harder than ever before. 2 years later, he joins the tournament to exact revenge on Kazuya, while Lee Chaolan, the last remaining Mishima, although adopted, is trained by Wang Jinrei in order to honor Jinpachi's ideals. Breezing through the tournament, defeating Lee Chaolan along the way, Heihachi finally arrives at the finals, where he faces off against Kazuya. In the first round, Heihachi defeats Kazuya, and Kazuya's evil nature is revealed in full. Before Heihachi's eyes, the devil gene within Kazuya takes him over, transforming him into Devil. In the 2 years between the first tournament, Devil had been counseling Kazuya in all aspects of his life and manipulating him accordingly, which is why the Saibatsu grew the way it did. Due to the hatred for his father, Kazuya's evil side is easier to manipulate in contrast to his good side, which he in fact does have. He's not purely evil, although it's hard to think otherwise. His good side manifests itself as Angel, who is constantly battling Devil to determine Kazuya's action. Since Angel is not a part of Kazuya's soul, the person possibly responsible for the existence of his good side is Jun Kazama, who he met during the tournament, before his fight with Heihachi. Jun initially entered the tournament to stop Kazuya's smuggling of endangered animals, but when she finally met him, she sensed a mysterious power within him, and eventually had a change of heart. Within the Kazama family, Jun received the title of Chosen One, as she had psychic abilities that let her sense and suppress Kazuya's devil gene. They have a strange mutual attraction towards one another, and Jun's mind eventually changes. She now wants to help Kazuya escape Devil's grasp. This fails, as Jun leaves the tournament after some time and Kazuya eventually transforms into Devil. We later learn that Kazuya impregnated Jun, but it is unknown whether this was consensual. While there is an ambiguity to their relationship, we believe that Kazuya and Jun genuinely care for one another. As Jun can suppress the devil gene, this might be why Kazuya became attracted to her in the first place. She fulfills something for him no one else in the world ever could.
Kazama Jun. 不思議な女だった。
While the Mishimas are unkillable by bullets, killer robots, and explosions, they're not impervious to love and affection. Kazuya had an affectionate relationship with his grandfather, and Heihachi loved his wife Kazumi, so it is not unthinkable that Kazuya loves Jun. Getting back to the fight between Heihachi and Kazuya, Kazuya transformed into Devil after losing the first round to his father, but it wasn't a complete transformation. He is torn between Devil and Angel, battling his hatred for his father and his presumed love for Jun. Due to this, Heihachi defeats Kazuya, and Devil flees Kazuya's mortally wounded body and tries to inhabit the body of Jun's unborn son, but she fights him off. To one-up his son, Heihachi decides to drop Kazuya's dying body into an active volcano, and he leaves by helicopter with a smile on his face, super stoked that he murdered his only son. The story for this game is one of the most significant in the series, partly because it introduces a story Easter egg we wouldn't find relevant for almost 20 years. Whenever you are fighting Heihachi in arcade mode, you fight him in his stage, a pagoda temple. If you keep pushing Heihachi back, you will eventually see an Ayagasa marking on the floor that shows Heihachi and Kazumi's name. An Ayagasa is a typical Japanese tradition. The couple writes their own names under an umbrella, signifying their love for each other. This marking is interesting in more ways than one. Firstly, it is always to the right, meaning it's behind Heihachi, which can be symbolic for Heihachi being deeply protective of both his love for Kasumi and Kasumi herself. Secondly, the marking is also shown yet again in the Tekken 7 reveal trailer, meaning it is a story thread 20 years in the making, and that the Pagoda Temple holds a deeper meaning than being just a stage in Tekken 2. The Pagoda Temple is a recurring stage in Tekken, and we will keep exploring its relevancy when it's appropriate. Touching elements like this make the stages more believable in Tekken 2 than its predecessor. There are small elements on each stage that make them seem like actual locations, like the helipad stage, which has working signal lights.
Jun might be the most significant character in the entire Tekken series, especially considering that she has been in only one canonical entry so far. Without Jun, the story for Tekken 3 through 6 would simply not exist as we know it today, as we're introduced to a new primary protagonist because of her. Due in part to her popularity, we would also see her spiritual successor later on. The ending song, Landscape Under the Ghost, is sung by Shirai Shirioko, who would eventually voice Jun's spiritual successor. To make this come full circle, she would later re-record Landscape Under the Ghost for the Tekken Tag Tournament 2 ending.
At the end of the tournament, Heihachi Mishima takes control of the Mishima Saibatsu, Jun Kazama went into hiding, and Paul Phoenix is stuck in traffic. Kazuya is presumed dead. The other competitors' lives keep going, and most of them weren't that interested in the tournament to begin with. Even as early as the second game, the tournament is no longer the primary motivation for most of the cast, it just coincides with their original intentions. The only ones with the specific goal of winning the tournament to win fame and glory is probably Paul Phoenix and anyone else in dire financial straits like Law. This shift in settings allowed them to focus on continuing each character's story with the tournament announcement simply as the primer.
Characters would get out of their drunken stupor to prove themselves, or they had a chance at getting some fast cash. That being said, there are characters like Paul Phoenix who just love the thrill of a good fight, and they know they can fight world-class martial artists in the King of Iron Fist tournament. While the Mishimas want to win, it's not fueled by any worldly ambitions, they just hate their family.
So Tekken 2 changed the landscape for future Tekken games, even though the development team probably didn't know it at the time. For instance, this is actually the last canonical entry for a rather large part of the cast, and considering Tekken 2 came out in 1995, that is 4 games and 19 years without a canonical showing. In total there are 8 characters that we never canonically see again, but 5 of those get spiritual successors in later games, so Namco is cheating a little bit. Still, the fact that they never show up again still stands. Rounding up the story segment before moving on, we would like to clear up a few story misconceptions, because due to the regional releases and translations done by each region, the story slightly differs depending on which version of the game you get your hands on. This is something we simply have to live with until we finish up the original trilogy, because after that point, every character was given an in-game prologue and epilogue when playing story mode. While this doesn't sound like a big deal, it kind of is. Every character ends up in the same place in the story, but how they got there can be vastly different. For example, in King's case, he either lost a child in his care or he did not receive enough money to start his orphanage. Both result in him becoming a drunk, but the key element is the emotional impact both stories tell, or fail to tell. King isn't a man of such weak moral fiber that he loses sight of his goals simply because he failed to get enough money, but losing an orphan child he loves is an understandable reason for him to break down. For these reasons, we picked the stories that seem to make the most sense with what we know of the characters, whenever there were conflicting stories. With the release of an extremely successful sequel, Tekken had shown it had what it took to survive, and for many it became the go-to 3D fighting game for anyone in the arcades. Virtua Fighter was more technical, while Tekken had a more casual approach, so even though players didn't have the technical know-how, they could still randomly hit buttons and get cool things to happen. Tekken was just more accessible for the general public. Speaking of Virtua Fighter, Namco had some help from the beginning when developing Tekken 1 and 2, and that was the work of Seiichi Ishii. Seiichi Ishii was Yu Suzuki's right-hand man on the first Virtua Fighter, and Yu Suzuki is considered Sega's answer to Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto. Seiichi Ishii probably helped guide Tekken's direction and made it better than it originally would have been. Having a director with hands-on experience with a 3D fighting game is an advantage that cannot be understated. It's essentially cheating, especially in a time when everyone was just trying stuff out, seeing what would work or not. After finishing up work on Tekken 2, he left Namco and started his own company called Dream Factory, where he made a few fighting games on his own. Having one of the key people leave sounds like this could mean trouble, but Katsuhiro Harada stepped up to the plate and became project director alongside Masahiro Kimoto. There's a reason why Katsuhiro Harada is deeply revered with the Tekken fanbase, and it might be because, well, the guy made Tekken 3. After the success of Tekken 2, work naturally began on the sequel, and at this point they were probably looking into shedding their stigma as the fighting game you could buy on the cheap. To help with this, they made Tekken 3 on the Namco System 12 board instead of the inferior Namco System 11. With the System 12, the processing speed was 1.5 times faster, so the game would look more detailed and gameplay could be seriously improved. Their primary goals with Tekken 3 was to make it more fun than Tekken 2 and spending more time with balancing the characters and overall gameplay. The Tekken 3 arcade version was completed in March 1997 and hit the scene like a bombshell, but there was something different with this one. Before Tekken 3, limbs in the polygon models weren't connected, they were individual elements that made up a character. In Tekken 3, all the limbs are connected together to form a single body. They combined this with motion capture. The initial goal for Tekken was to create a fighting game with realistic martial arts animation, so motion capture was a natural stepping stone towards that goal. It provides more realistic and authentic animation while being more cost-effective, but the best motion capture technology means nothing without genuine martial artists to show it off. Fortunately for the development team, the martial artists they hired took it seriously. They didn't consider it just a dumb game for kids. The martial artists put a lot of thought into the characters, and some of them even had a final say when it came to certain design choices. King was motion captured by Minoru Suzuki and Osami Shibuya, two popular pro wrestlers. Newcomers Eddie Gordo and Hwoarang were brought to life by Mestre Marcelo Pereira and Hwang Soo-il. Hwang Soo-il is an ITF world champion, and he is one of the most famous Taekwondo practitioners. Some of that comes from mocapping Hwoarang. Taekwondo in a fighting game makes sense, but Eddie Gordo practices capoeira, which is more of an art form than a martial art. So Mestre Marcelo originally had a few reservations about doing it. He himself feels that capoeira is often being misrepresented as some sort of fighting martial art, but he felt honored to be able to represent his beloved capoeira in a fighting game. Mestre Marcelo liked for the most part the way Eddie Gordo turned out, and the developers were happy to keep his wishes in mind when designing the character. In fact, Eddie Gordo's nickname Faísca means spark in Portuguese, which was a nickname Marcelo had given one of his students. In his own words about Eddie, on a scale of 0 to 10, I give Eddie Gordo a 6. The names chosen for the capoeira movements are pretty off the wall and are not like the traditional names I call the movements as I was motion captured. Eddie's attire could be improved to better reflect the capoeira standards. Please keep in mind that I am very critical because I am very authentic to my art. Overall, I do like the character Eddie Gordo, but to be appealing to an audience that knows practically nothing about capoeira, maybe this is just the way he needed to be presented. The team originally wanted to include a capoeiraista for Tekken 2, but this was never realized, so they did it in Tekken 3 instead. The strange part is that Tekken 3 has gotten a lot of credit for its motion capture, but the earlier games uses mocap as well, so why does Tekken 3 stand out so much? What we do know is what Yutaka Konoe said in this Retro Gamer magazine interview. Essentially, we hardly used motion capture at all for Tekken 1 and 2. At that point, motion capture was just a developing industry, so we used the magnetic system to capture a portion of the movements we required. This was a method where everything had to be recorded with cables attached, and it wasn't suited to intense action, so we could only use it for reference. However, the promotional department leveraged the appeal of motion capture technology for marketing and made out that we had used it extensively. The motion in Tekken was minutely adjusted to perfection, frame by frame, so even if we had used motion capture, we would have had to redo most of it anyway. This was the first time in Tekken history where the arcade board was more powerful than the PlayStation, which meant that concessions had to be made. Now, this is not to say that Tekken 1 and 2 were perfect arcade ports, but this is the first time there was a visual downgrade. It was fairly minor, but the polygon count for characters went down, backgrounds were originally 3D but became 2D panoramic images, and the game played at an overall lower resolution. Tekken 2 wasn't an easy port either, because the amount of data for that game was huge, so much so that King's data by itself reached the limit of what could be compressed down for the PlayStation. In Tekken 3, the data was 3 times larger, but they were still able to compress it down for the PlayStation, all while adding more extras than ever seen before. The work on the PlayStation conversion began in June 1997 and came out a year later. All the modes from Tekken 2 remained intact, but they still felt like they needed to add more, so they added Tekken Ball and Tekken Force. Tekken Ball was volleyball mixed with brawling. You punched a ball to make it damage your opponent, and the more damage you managed to stack onto it, the more it would sting. Tekken Force was an homage to the classic beat-em-ups that paved the way for fighting games as we know them today. You would pick your Tekken character and beat your way through hordes of enemies until you got to the stage boss, usually related to whoever you were playing as, and then you made it to the next stage. It was on a timer, so you needed to be highly aggressive to beat it, as knocking guys out added time to the clock. In that way, it was very similar to the high difficulty levels of the arcade beat-em-ups, but the healthy trade-off was that you could try again whenever you died, instead of putting in another quarter. New programmers joined the project to work on these modes, and it didn't take that much time to complete, so why not throw in a few secret rewards? Beat Tekken Force 3 times and you'll have 3 keys, which lets you fight Dr. Boskonovich the next time you get to the last boss. Defeat him and he becomes a playable fighter.
Round 1. Fight!
While that is a humorous addition, he's an important character in the story. He's a good friend to Yoshimitsu, he created the Jack unit, and was kidnapped by Kazuya where he put Nina and Anna in cryosleep, as well as work on several other experiments. One secret character was probably enough, but manga artist Masashi Tanaka contacted Namco with a curious request. He wondered if they could put a character of his own creation into the game, and so they did. Masashi Tanaka started publication of the manga Gon in 1991, which featured the adventures of a tiny dinosaur called Gon, and how he interacts with the world he lives in. Gon is a unique manga because it is completely wordless, and for a manga to feature no dialogue or onomatopoetic words was completely unheard of at the time, and it still is. So what does Gon have to do with Tekken? Well, nothing really, but Namco agreed and made Gon a playable character. The interesting part about this collaboration is that Namco accepted it to begin with. Gon is not a part of the plot, and most likely not even canon to the series. But they stretched their hands out to someone who loves Tekken, and it's one of the key factors that has made Tekken as explosively popular as it is today. They look to their fans for feedback, input, and they accept collaborations with talents from other walks of life. Tekken finally added sidestepping to its game, so players could now step into or out of the background. Sidestepping is the most noticeable change in Tekken 3, but it's something other 3D fighters used before, like Battle Arena Toshinden and Virtua Fighter. So it seemed about time that Namco caught up. This is the biggest addition to any Tekken game to date, because it completely changed how the game was played. Stepping in and out of the third axis allowed players to trick and confuse each other, and while it was mainly used for defensive purposes, it could set up some very damaging situations. As a direct result of finally playing in an actual 3D space, you can now throw from all 4 cardinal directions. Low parries were added, and grapplers like King finally had low throws that could catch crouchers. With all these technical elements added to the game, it was only a matter of time before Tekken veteran players started tinkering with the possibilities. They realized that you could cancel momentum-based moves as early as possible but still retain all the benefits, and this gave birth to something called wave dashing. If this is unfamiliar to you, it might seem strange and maybe even pointless, but it is a very important tool. You're able to cover a large distance almost instantly, and every single one of the dashes can be cancelled into an attack. It's like someone is pointing a loaded gun at you, and the trigger can be pulled at any given time. After players discovered wave dashing, they started experimenting, and they found a whole slew of other dashes. There were light dashes, snake dashes, Korean back dashes, haha steps, fog steps, and so on. Each of these dashes require different inputs and work in different ways. They're highly technical and require practicing to the point that it becomes second nature. Just like breathing, it's not something you're supposed to consciously think about, except now that I just told you. With the introduction of a true 3D space, distancing and the angle of your characters now became more important than ever. This is why movement tools like this were so valuable, and since each of them served a different purpose, that's why there are so many of them. Aside from that, general balancing and bigger move list, the system didn't change all that much, with the exception of chickening. In Tekken 2 they added attack reversals, and chickening is reversing an attack reversal. The input escape window is so short for chickening that it's nearly impossible to do it on reflex, but the game lets you know if you did it correctly.
Chicken.
Up until this point we've mainly talked about the technical and graphical elements, but there's something we have yet to cover. The music. Listening to the soundtrack of the trilogy back to back, you can tell how much the sound department has grown and how they changed from taking the music of the time and evolving it to fit the game, themes, and characters. Before the advent of CD-based technology, video games had to rely on synthesized electronic music, also known as 8-bit music or a chiptune. This was because the technology they had available was very limiting, so instead of recording actual instruments, they had to simulate them. They had to work around these limitations, but they picked up a few tricks to make tracks memorable. One of the more important ones was keeping it simple.
なんだろう、私だからカプコンに行った時に教えていただいた先輩がとりあえずゲームは覚えやすいメロディーを作らないとみんなでこうゲームをしてる人に忘れられちゃうから。だから覚えやすいメロディーを作るように心がけなさいって一度言われたことがあったんですよ。それがもうずっと延々25年間続いて、ゲームを作る時には覚えやすいメロディーを作らなきゃいけないなっていうのがもうトラウマのようになってて、だからそういうメロディーをこれからも多分作り続けると思います。
With Tekken, they didn't have all these limitations and could record actual instruments on a CD with a lot of storage, so what does Tekken sound like? For the original game, they created a soundtrack that fit the time and had an energetic feel to it, just like the kind of music you would find in a dance club. Even though each track is dedicated to locations around the world, it sounds very Japanese, or at the very least, what a sound team in Japan might think that location sounds like. When Tekken 2 came around, they decided to control some of that high energy by creating a personalized track for each character. It seems like they got the budget to play around with different sounds and structure, and they ended up with a lot of unique compositions. Yoshimitsu's track starts off like Japanese classical music. Before launching into a techno track. Which fits the duality of the Japanese cyber ninja. Paul's track is as explosive as he is, while Kazuya's is foreboding and ominous. Some of the tracks don't really fit the mold of an action-filled fighting game, like Jun's theme. But it does fit her character perfectly. For Tekken 3, they shifted away from the pop and electro techno sounds to shift more towards punk, rock, and big beat music. It uses guitars, drums, bass, and percussion instruments to create tracks that are thematically similar but unique at the same time. Eddie Gordo's track uses scratching and a beat you could expect to hear in hip-hop. While Foran's track sounds like acid funk. They are still able to infuse the characters' personalities into the tracks, just listen to Brian Fury's. There's a certain mechanical insanity to it, which fits a cyborg zombie. There are so many layers to each and every track here, and it requires a lot of attention to take it all in, which may run contrary to the nature of video game music. They targeted the rebellious youth of the time, and they did it with some swagger. Having advanced the story with some big changes previously, they wanted to keep this forward momentum going, and they had gotten some valuable feedback from both fans and the arcades. With the arcade version of Tekken 2, it was possible to see how many times players chose characters, and the rival characters were almost never chosen over the original ones they were based on. They also felt that some of the early character designs were a bit too simple. Look at Michelle's second costume, it's just a black sweater with jeans. So they wanted a chance to redesign their original characters, but have it fit within the story. For these reasons, they decided to throw out most of the cast and essentially reboot the series, by skipping 15 years ahead in the story. 6 characters remained from the original cast, with 15 added to the roster. 2 additional characters were PlayStation exclusives, making it a total of 17 new characters. We're now introduced to the newer generation of characters within the Tekken universe, and even seeing sons and daughters of characters we knew previously, like Martial Law's son, Forest Law, and Michelle Chang's adopted daughter, Julia Chang. It is no longer a world filled with random characters. It's a living, breathing world where people are born, live, and die. Some characters have unfortunately passed away, like King and Kuma, but are succeeded by their family. If you don't know or didn't follow the story, it might be hard to understand that King died, as he's in the game. And some new characters are arguably just palette swaps, but this is hardly a new thing at this point. While they threw away most of their characters and gave a new twist to old ones, there was still room for new blood in the roster, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, the story begins after Heihachi left his son for dead and took control of the Saibatsu. After Heihachi took control over the Mishima Saibatsu, he started cleaning up after his son's mess and ended up establishing the Tekken Force, an organization dedicated to the protection of the Mishima Saibatsu, as well as doing Heihachi's bidding. He set out to win the trust of world leaders by putting wars and conflicts to rest. He also takes interest in the well-being of developing nations by helping them build agricultural systems that will sustain them. Fast forward 15 years, and Heihachi's hard work has led to world peace. But during an excavation in Mexico, a squadron of his Tekken Force spots a mysterious life form. Heihachi orders the creature's capture, but his Tekken Force is slaughtered. He receives a garbled radio message and goes to investigate. What he finds is a field of corpses and destruction. Whoever did this was still alive and would later become known as Ogre. This reawakened Heihachi's long dormant dreams of world domination, and he becomes obsessed with learning more about Ogre. Within weeks, strange disappearances occur throughout the world. Masters of martial arts and other fighting disciplines are reported missing, while some have been outright killed, King being one of them. In Yakushima, Japan, Jin Kasama is living a quiet life with her young son Jin. Jun senses a dark power aiming for her life, and although she doesn't understand why, she accepts her destiny. She tells Jin everything she knows about herself and his father to prepare him for the fateful day she feels is imminent. If anything should happen to her, she tells Jin to go to his grandfather Heihachi. Her fears prove right, and on a cold, stormy night, Ogre comes to the mountains. Seeing this, Jun cries out for her son to run away, but Jin wants to protect his mother. He's easily defeated and knocked unconscious, and when Jin finally wakes up, the house and everything around it is burned to the ground. Jin searches frantically, but his mother is nowhere to be found. Jun is presumed dead at Ogre's hands, and Jin honors her instructions and meets with Heihachi. Jin explains what has happened and begs to be trained in order to exact revenge.
力だけを求めていた。圧倒的な力を。
Hearing Jin's story, Heihachi is convinced that Ogre is after the souls of powerful fighters, and decides to host the King of Iron Fist tournament to attract him in the future. 4 years later, on Jin Kazama's 19th birthday, the curtains rise for the third King of Iron Fist tournament. Having become the new poster boy for the series, let's briefly discuss Jin's character design. As Street Fighter's Ryu has proven, there's a certain virtue in a simple but recognizable character design. Kazuya was an homage to Ryu, and Jin is an extension of that. Kazuya's most defining visual characteristics are his gloves, scar, and hairstyle. Jin's hairstyle is a mix of Kazuya and Jun's, and they gave him intricately designed gauntlets with matching foot protectors. Like his father, he fights shirtless, but instead of a scar, he wears a black mark on his left arm, a result of his father's pact with the devil. Finishing it off, and to add a bit of flair to his design, he wears black pants with flames coming up the right side. Jin's primary design motif is flame, which is continued in later games. It's a very simple but striking design that is both a natural and logical extension of his heritage. It fits for a main character as it is instantly recognizable. Since Jin has taken center stage, we get a refreshing new take on things. While it's still just another revenge story, Jin isn't as one note as Heihachi or Kazuya, because he seems to have a life outside of the tournament. He even attends Mishima High School with Ling Xiaoyu, who has a crush on him. And during his travels, he met both friends and rivals. During his training, Jin visited a town where he met Hwarang, an arrogant and brash student of Baekdu-san who was hustling gang members for money. Hwarang tried to trick Jin the same way, but could only manage a draw when fighting him. This draws parallels to Kazuya's and Paul's rivalry, and Hwarang becomes Jin's long-standing rival. Frustrated that he couldn't win, he storms back to Beck's dojo, but he finds Beck dead on the floor, slain by Ogre. He devotes himself to rigorous training and joins the tournament to defeat Jin and seek revenge for his dead master. Veterans like Paul Phoenix, Yoshimitsu, and Heihachi have all aged quite a bit, with the exception of Nina and Anna, who have been in cryogenic sleep for 19 years. This is understandable, as Nina has always been the primary female character and sort of sex symbol for the series, so having her age might have been counterproductive. In Tekken 2, it seemed like they were trying to bring in Jun to take Nina's place, but her personality might have overlapped too much with Michelle, so she has taken the role of the tragic heroine. Ling Xiaoyu could have served as the poster girl for the series, especially since she's in love with Jin and is actually one of the few people Heihachi genuinely cares about. But she falls into the anime girl archetype, much like Sakura from the Street Fighter series. While the search for Tekken's poster girl keeps going, the tournament has already begun and fighters are dropping left, right and center. The three fighters that made it far in the tournament were Paul Phoenix, Jin Kazama, and Heihachi Mishima. Paul Phoenix had gone undefeated throughout the entire tournament, and he not only met Ogre in the finals, he even beat him. Swelling with pride, Paul had finally become the King of Iron Fist, so he went home. Unbeknownst to Paul, the tournament continued after he left, as Ogre morphed into his second form, True Ogre. So Jin Kazama finally met his mother's killer.
母の仇を前にした時何かが俺の中で弾けた
Moments later, Jin is gunned down by Heihachi. While training Jin, Heihachi noticed that Jin had tendencies to show the same dangerous power Kazuya had. Jin had inherited the devil gene from his father, so Heihachi used Jin as a decoy to lure out Ogre. Now that Ogre was dead, he no longer needed Jin, or the cursed devil gene, so he tried to kill him. However, he was too late, and Jin morphed into his devil form right then and there. The cursed destiny of the Mishima family lives on. This marks the end of the tournament, which ended the darkest chapter we would ever come to know in a Tekken story. The origins of Ogre, the Aztec fighting god, remains mostly unknown, but before Jin put a stop to him, he wandered the earth looking for strong fighters. He attacked and killed the first king, which was witnessed by Armor King and King's young apprentice. Armor King, out of respect for his friend, trains King's apprentice to succeed him. So the king we see in the game is one of the orphan children that was in King's care, and he is technically known as King too, but they just call him King in the games. Baekdu-san was attacked and left for dead by Ogre, and finally there's Jin's mother. One of the intros show Ogre holding a severed head with long hair in his hands, which is also prominently featured in his concept art. This was believed to be Jun's severed head, because the only characters in that intro is Jin, Jun, Kazuya, and Ogre. While it took a long time, Namco eventually confirmed that Jun's status is not dead and she is simply missing. Was this more misleading storytelling, or did they originally intend for it to be Jun's severed head? There are no more characters that are outright killed, but if you have a sharp eye, you can tell from Ogre's moveset that he has attacked more characters than mentioned. Ogre is a copycat of sorts, in that he steals a few moves from martial artists he has fought. We know he has fought Beck and Jun because he has Jun's windmill kick and Beck's hunting hawk, but he also has moves from Wang, King, Kuma, Anna, and Jack. So, who actually won the tournament? Well, Paul technically won, but forfeited. Jin then took over for Paul, and then Heihachi shot Jin in the face. After everything went down, Heihachi just took control over the Saibatsu, so for all intents and purposes, Paul won the tournament, but Heihachi kept the Mishima Saibatsu. Paul has remained an extremely strong fighter throughout the series, and even though his thick-headed nature is played for laughs, at the end of the day, he beat Ogre, leaving Jin to fight Ogre in a weakened state. Tekken 3 is considered by many to be the pinnacle of the series, as well as the best fighting game on the PlayStation. Namco took risks with pretty much every single aspect of the game, especially the story, but it was a gamble that paid off. When all the reviews and praise started coming in, the team was more confused than pleased. They didn't understand the praise, because for them, there were elements they still wanted to implement, but couldn't. The capstone of the trilogy was praised for its outstanding visuals, immense depth, and new characters, and considering how the Tekken games were originally received, it's a fascinating journey. Tekken 1 and 2 weren't really popular in the Japanese arcades, and Virtua Fighter almost held a monopoly on competitive 3D fighting, so you could almost never find Tekken tournaments back then. It was mostly held for Virtua Fighter. However, Tekken did very well outside of Japan, and while this is speculation, part of the reason why Tekken survived might have been due to fantastic reception on the console side. In many ways, the PlayStation versions were superior, especially if you wanted to learn more about the characters and felt like most fighting games had very little to offer as a console release. That about wraps it up for now. We hope you liked it and that you'll look forward to the next part. We'll try to do better next time.